Arcade classic Pong is cemented in history as the world's first commercially successful video game. Its legacy spans decades, and if it weren't for its release in the early 70s by Atari, then the games industry as we know it today might not exist. But is Pong hiding something? A subliminal, monumental mystery with global implications, undiscovered until today. Is Pong secretly a communist propaganda video game? (1972). Pong had its first commercial release, and the world was in the midst of a Cold War. The mid-20th century was an interesting period of military research, with operations such as MK Ultra, a series of experiments surrounding mind control technology conducted by the CIA. Science fiction and reality was separated by an ever-blurring line, and anything was considered worthy of government funding if it meant a tactical advantage. With that preface, let's talk about Alan Alcorn, the original developer of Pong. He made the game as a programming exercise under guidance from Atari co-founder Nolan Bushnell. What's interesting to note is that Alcorn graduated a year prior, in 1971, with a Bachelor of Science degree from the University of California, Berkeley. Since 1901, the University of California has been home to the Department of Slavic Languages and Literature. This department is very important. It may have existed since prior to the Russian Revolution, the rise of the Soviet Union, and the aforementioned Cold War, but its continued existence to this day means that it was in fact in operation during this time, and while Alcorn studied at UC Berkeley. We also know that the USSR employed sleeper agents from throughout the Eastern Bloc, smuggled through Canada into the United States. What better place to plant a Soviet sleeper agent than in an academic role within a Slavic languages and literature department? Alcorn may not have carried out his studies in this department, but in an interview with Retro Gamer, he talks about his involvement in the Flower Power movement of the 1960s and his membership of the People's Park, a student hippie commune targeted by tear gas wielding government forces. The Flower Power movement was a counterculture in the late 60s and early 70s that protested the US involvement in the Vietnam War and advocated peace within the Eastern Bloc, and thus we can easily assume that Alcorn shared some of these views. If we connect this with his presence at UC Berkeley and the potential Russian sleeper agents being present within the Department of Slavic Languages and Literature, then it's very possible that Alcorn may have interacted with such individuals, and were this interaction to occur, it's not unimaginable that the subject of the Soviet Union and communism may have arisen. Perhaps Alcorn was converted to the cause. Inconclusive but not inconceivable given his left-leaning history, and with Pong's development taking place in time for a 1972 release, this hypothetical interaction would be fresh in his mind. Now, we know that at least the United States explored some rather left-field methods of tactical advantage. We also know that the Soviet Union often attempted to inspire American defectors to betray the US and convert more to the cause. Perhaps then, the two could intersect. Perhaps when Alcorn was tasked with developing Pong by Bushnell, he saw an opportunity. He claims in the same Retro Gamer interview prior that he did not expect the game to be a success, nor did Bushnell. But what if this is a fabrication? Perhaps he had insight and envisioned the eventual boom in success for Pong. If he did, and were to follow my theory as containing elements of truth, then it's equally plausible that given the general awareness of such mind control experiments as MKUltra, and the 60s 70s paranoia of subliminal messaging in media like music and television, that Alcorn programmed subliminal messaging into the very core of Pong. Let's briefly analyse how Pong works and see if there's anything within the game to suggest this. Pong is a table tennis simulation. Immediately, we see a connection to communism because in 1971, we see the first game of table tennis between the United States and China, at that time a communist state, which led to many coining the political warfare between the two nations leading up to the event as ping-pong diplomacy. Perhaps Pong is not only a simulation of table tennis, but also a simulation of ping-pong diplomacy between the United States and communism. A stretch, I know, but what's undeniable is that in the wake of Pong's release, movements like the SDS-WSA grew in popularity and success, forming connections with workers' movements across the country, and even with the Republic of Cuba. They were formed largely of ex-students, and if I know one thing from being a student myself, is that students like video games. It's therefore a valid assumption to make that some of the SDS-WSA's membership were individuals who at one point or another played Pong. What's also worth mentioning is the arcade myth of Polybius, a game of questionable existence. It was supposedly introduced in arcade in 1981, developed by a non-existent company called Sinus Losion. The urban legend states that the game was part of a government-run psychology experiment that produced psychoactive effects in those who played the game, and was constantly watched by mysterious men in black. It's entirely likely that Polybius is an amalgamation of various arcade horror stories of the 20th century, but perhaps some of them, like psychological effects, weren't just horror stories. Now, nothing can be stated as fact. All of the evidence that I've presented relies heavily on hypothetical interpretation and should be taken with a grain of salt. There are a lot of very interesting coincidences though, and in a world with conspiracy-grade operations like MKUltra and urban legends like Polybius, how can we really be sure that Pong isn't communism?
Subterfuge.